The Dallas Mavericks shocked many NBA fans last year as they made a push for the NBA Finals, but when they got there, it was pretty clear that they were dramatically outmatched by a much better constructed Boston Celtics team. Luckily, this offseason, they have had some pretty big moves, but there has been some debate as to whether or not these moves have actually moved the needle enough. Hello everybody, welcome to Us Rusty Buckets. Subscribe to the channel if you're over on YouTube and drop a like. We're trying to hit 200k subscribers on this channel by the end of the year, so your subscription is much appreciated. And go ahead and check us out over on Spotify if you want to enjoy this as an audio-only experience. Also, I need to give a quick shout out. The thumbnail for this video, as well as some of the basic stat research, was done by the newest member of the Rusty Buckets company. AlexHoops is joining the staff, so everybody clap. So thank you to him for the thumbnail. He's going to be doing those going forward. But with that said, I wanted to talk about the Dallas Mavericks because I didn't actually get a chance to talk about their offseason because unfortunately a lot of their major moves happened while I was on vacation. I was planning on recording away, but unfortunately the internet was so dog shit that I was only able to get one video out that entire time. So I want to talk about the offseason that the Mavericks had and whether or not this is much of an improvement, if an improvement at all, because a lot of people have been debating that exact argument because, you know, one of the key players that they lost, Derrick Jones Jr., was one of the key players for the push that they made in the postseason in general. I actually had a lot of suggestions for what this team should do going forward. Losing Derrick Jones was not one of them, but I also did feel like replacing him in the starting lineup was the move. And the Mavs went with what I would call probably the biggest boom or bust option in terms of replacing him in the starting lineup, and that is, of course, by adding Klay Thompson to the roster. Klay Thompson's at a weird spot in the NBA. The fact that he is currently in a Dallas Mavericks jersey is proof enough that he's in a weird spot because we all thought he was going to retire a Warrior. But the last couple of years for Klay have been very contentious. I think there's a couple of reasons for that, and I think there is blame to be assigned to multiple parties in this case. I do not think it's as simple as Klay Thompson was being a baby, therefore that's why this all went down. I also think there is a weird, incorrect, mixed perception about what Klay Thompson is as a player due to some of his areas where he's lacking where he wasn't previous. So obviously Klay Thompson at his peak was one of the greatest shooters of all time, one of the greatest off-ball movers of all time, and when I say that, I'm talking like top 5 in all of these categories. Wasn't top 5 in this category, but he was also an excellent perimeter defender, not quite like all defense worthy. I don't think he ever made an all defensive team, but he was a very, very good perimeter defender and would often end up guarding the best team's guard whenever, you know, regardless of who the Warriors were facing, because of course Stephen Curry wasn't really built to guard all-star guards one-on-one, and Klay Thompson very much was because he had the lateral quickness, but he was also a big, bulky shooting guard, like a big enough to play small forward but playing the 2, which is why he's actually going to be playing small forward for the Dallas Mavericks going forward. But of course, ever since he tore his Achilles and ACL, I think those injuries happened back-to-back to cause him to be out of the league for 2 years. He's lost a step and then some defensively, not nearly as quick laterally as he used to be. He is a strong body still. He is still a bulky defender. Other than like defending in the post, not doing a lot defensively. His off-ball instincts are not quite there as much as they used to be, and on-ball, he's just not scaring defenders or offensive players in the way that he used to. But that said, the number one asset that Klay Thompson has always brought to the table was his three-point shooting. Being able to catch and shoot the ball better than just about anybody else in the league. And while a lot of things about Klay's game has gotten worse, make no mistake, the ability to shoot, catch, and shoot threes is very much still a prominent part of his game. Now, the splits are not as good as they used to be because another issue he has had since coming back from these injuries is I feel like his shot selection has gotten pretty dramatically worse. There's another good reason for that, which is the Warriors. I kind of get why Klay had an issue taking a step down in his offensive role in Golden State, and that's simply because they didn't really have the other options to replace him. Like, it's not as though Klay Thompson was getting in the way of, you know, Podziemski averaging or Pod, how do you say that guy's fucking name again? Pods. Wasn't getting in the way of him averaging 20 points, wasn't getting in the way of Andrew Wiggins averaging 20 points, sure as fuck wasn't getting in the way of Chris Paul averaging 20 points. From his point of view, it's like, well, why the fuck wouldn't I shoot the ball? The only other guy on the floor who's a better offensive player than me is Stephen Curry. And that's fair. And that's more of a product of the Warriors doing a terrible job building this team. I think in retrospect, the Jordan Poole move was quite bad. Obviously, Jordan Poole sucked with the Wizards, but he also averaged 17 on damn near 50, 40, 90 for their entire 2022 playoff run and was really good at points in the finals. So, you know, especially just given how lacking this team was in scoring options, the thing that I have been saying specifically about the Warriors the last few years is their number one issue is no one besides for Steph can score the ball. And back when, you know, the Warriors were at their peak, Stephen Curry was scoring a little bit more than he currently is, especially given the context of how teams are averaging even more points now than they were back then. But also Klay Thompson in his off-ball role was better, more selective, and there was a offensive system that elevated all the other role players around them to the degree where a very prominent second-level shot creator wasn't all that necessary. Obviously, they went and then added that with Kevin Durant, but we can all agree that that was just overkill, not necessary for them to be a contender, as proven by them eventually being a contender and winning a championship in 2022. But Klay Thompson's looking at the Warriors roster as it currently is and going, why the fuck should I be sacrificing? Because I am a better shooter than everybody here besides for Stephen Curry, and frankly, I'm probably still a better scorer than everybody here besides for Stephen Curry. That's a problem with the Warriors. It's not a problem that the Dallas Mavericks have. The Dallas Mavericks have the offensive weapons, are obviously most prominently Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving, to where Klay Thompson can very confidently take less shots. It's something that he can sacrifice now because he doesn't feel as though a much worse player is going to be taking those shots. I actually think Klay said something specifically to the media about like, yeah, I have Kyrie and Luka scoring on the perimeter. I'm not really going to be as needed as I used to be. He's even made comments about like wanting to age gracefully as a shooter in the same way that Ray Allen did when he went to the Miami Heat. And I think those are encouraging comments. Now, Klay has also been inconsistent as it relates to his comments. A lot of times where he has said that, you know, this is what he wants to do, and then he ends up doing the opposite, saying he's okay embracing the bench role, but then being pouty about it, things like that. So I would take everything he said with a grain of salt, but the point of the roster construction for the Mavericks just being so dramatically different to a degree that really helps Klay, that point rings true. Another thing that I saw, Klay Thompson and his on-ball creation is not necessarily great. It's not terrible, not as bad as you would be led to believe. And I think that's primarily just because the guy is known as like maybe the best off-ball scorer, period. Like Stephen Curry's technically better at it, but he gets a lot more of his offense on the ball, whereas Klay was pretty strictly an off-ball player exclusively. But the guy still has a one dribble mid-range pull-up that is a better shot than a lot of other players can generate. And he has some ability in the pick and roll, and specifically with a give and go game with a big man. And this was something that I don't remember who posted about it, so I apologize. But someone highlighted that with the Warriors last year, Klay Thompson had his best plus minus and looked the best as a distributor and as a scorer when, I'm trying to remember what his first name is, with the center Jackson Davis, I think it starts with a T. I'm so mad I'm blanking on his first name right now. When he was in the game, the most athletic big that the Warriors have, Klay looked considerably better. Trace Jackson Davis. When it was Kevon Looney or Draymond Green, who are not athletic big men, different story. Not the same chemistry, not the same level of gravity going to the rim. And of course, the Dallas Mavericks have two very athletic big men. I don't think there's a team in the league that their starting center and their backup center are that athletic. Like, I just can't think of one, at least not immediately. Who's a backup center who's that good? I don't really think there is one. So Now, regardless of who the 5 on the floor ends up being, unless they're going with like a Maxi Kleber at the 5 lineup, Klay Thompson's going to have a more athletic big to have that give and go game with. And again, he's not going to be any higher than the second option on the floor any times where there were points with the Warriors where he was the first option because Steph was off of the floor. And that's just not tenable. But if Kyrie or Luka are primarily initiating all the offense, and then Klay Thompson can stick to what Klay Thompson does best, which is moving off ball for catch and shoot threes, then that's great. I have seen a lot of people act as though because the guy is washed in other aspects of his game, that means that the thing that he does best is something that he doesn't do best anymore, but he still very much does that the best. Klay Thompson last year, this is a stat from AlexHoops, so shout out to him for pulling this up. 38% on catch and shoot threes. 10th best in the entire league with any player who was taking a minimum of 5 catch and shoot threes per game. So the guy is still elite catching and shooting the ball. And if you recall looking in the 2024 finals, the biggest issue for the Dallas Mavericks, bar none, as much as people like to focus on Luka's defense or whatever, the biggest issue was that their role players were missing their catch and shoot threes. I don't remember what the percentage was by the end of the series, but I know over the first 3 or 4 games, players not named Luka Doncic on the Mavericks were shooting in total 10% from 3. That's as disastrous gets. Klay Thompson is not going to do that. He might take a couple of dumb mid-range shots. He might mess up a rotation on defense, but he's going to hit his catch and shoot threes. Now, that immediately begs the question, how are you going to handle this defensive difference? Because Klay Thompson is not as good of a defender as Derrick Jones Jr. is. Well, I think Najee Marshall and to a smaller extent Quentin Grimes were additions to hopefully make up for that if they have to do that. Obviously, you would prefer if your starting forward just had the defense on lock to a degree that you're not concerned about it, but they do have backup options to put on the floor. But also, the Dallas Mavericks defense was not just wholly hinged on Derrick Jones Jr., and the Dallas Mavericks defense was good in the Celtics series. I know people don't like to think that because, like, Luka had his bad moments, of course. That was something that was highlighted a lot, but in terms of the actual defensive impact, in terms of how the Mavericks were defending the Boston Celtics throughout that series, they defended the Boston Celtics better than anybody else did. And Derrick Jones Jr. no doubt played a big part in that, but a lot of it is that Jason Kidd gets so much more out of his defensive personnel with his scheme, as well as the fact that Derek Lively is just a phenomenal defensive player who, to a degree, can get you to a contending level defense, not quite single-handedly, but as long as a couple other guys are locked in and trying their best, you're going to get a decent enough defense. And then, on the other end, if you have Kyrie and Luka doing Kyrie and Luka shit instead of Kyrie just fucking sucking, and you have a knock down one of the best catch and shoot guys of all time on the floor on top of that, it's going to be damn hard to defend. No doubt the Mavericks will be a little bit worse defensively than they were in this previous playoff run. I'm sure of that. But I'm also so sure that they will be dramatically better offensively to the degree that they have overall improved just with this Klay Thompson move alone. And we haven't even gotten to the other additions, other than me briefly mentioning them, Najee Marshall and Quentin Grimes, because these guys ended up replacing Josh Green. And then I guess Najee Marshall is like kind of a Derrick Jones replacement, but also Klay Thompson is. But in terms of like the idea of the 3-and-D forward who's more D than he is 3, Najee Marshall is exactly that. And I honestly think there's an argument to be made that he is better than Derrick Jones Jr. because his defensive stats as good, if not better. In fact, looking at defensive EPM, he was in the 91st percentile in the entire NBA. I'm just going to list off some numbers for you here. Allowed 0.9 points per possession while defending the pick and roll ball handler. That is elite. I think most of the time you're getting over 1 point per possession with the P&R ball handler. Excellent ISO defender. In fact, he only allows 0.64 points per possession in the isolation, which means that he is going to defend some of the league's top scorers just fine. 38.7 from 3 and 39.6% on catch and shoot threes. He averages 1.17 points on spot-up possessions, which puts him in the 84th percentile. So we're talking about a guy who is statistically one of the better perimeter defenders in the NBA and statistically one of the better catch and shoot guys. Now, there is some concern about his ability to actually maintain that shooting, because this is really the first season of his career where he's actually been lights out knockdown shooter. Like, that's not been his thing up to this point, and really his three ball being inconsistent was his biggest issue because he was a strong defender. Also, fun thing about Najee Marshall, pretty good playmaker, and something that I was, pretty critical of the Mavericks offense was like everybody else just having a complete inability to make a decision with the ball in their hands besides for Kyrie and Luka. Najee, better at that than Derrick Jones is. I'm quite confident at that. He doesn't have the same ability to just attack off of the catch and drive or, be a lob target in either maybe even the half court set, but usually in the fast break situation. Fair argument to say Najee Marshall is at least a similar player to Derrick Jones Jr. Quentin Grimes is replacing Josh Green, and I actually think on the surface they're probably relatively similar tier players. However, Quentin Grimes has shown more promise as a three-point shooter. Now, his previous season with the Knicks and then very briefly with the Detroit Pistons wasn't very good. This was partially because he just started getting, not partially, I'd say mainly because he started getting an inconsistent role within the Knicks rotation. Yeah, he went from playing 30 minutes a game to 20. He played 20 less games in total, took 2 less shots per game, declined across the board at the age of 22, which is not exactly what you want to see, or at the age of 23. However, the season before it, the last time that he got real starter minutes, or just real consistent minutes, which the consistency is the important part, 11 points per game, 3 rebounds per game, and 0.7 steals, and he shot 38.6% from 3 on just under 6 attempts a game. Now, if you go ahead and look at Josh Green, who is, I'm pretty sure these two were, if not directly traded for each other, it was more or less the same. Josh shot well from 3 on really low volume the past 2 years, around 40%. And if you look at his overall playoff numbers, his 3-ball looked good, but again, super low volume, and teams did not respect him from outside whatsoever. And there were multiple games where he did not make them pay for not respecting him at all. Quentin Grimes, I think, is far more likely to do that. So if we're just looking at your overall rotation players that you're replacing, like if Quentin is a swap for Josh Green, better three-point shooter. He also shot 71% at the rim in that season as a starter, which is worth mentioning. Also 44% on corner three-pointers, which is elite. He's replacing Josh Green. Najee Marshall and Klay Thompson are essentially replacing Tim Hardaway Jr. and Derrick Jones Jr. I think they're both probably better players than both of those players. Tim Hardaway was a catch and shoot guy who was one of the lowest in the entire league in terms of percentage on those catch and shoots for how high volume of a shooter he was. In fact, he was second lowest in percentage of any player taking at least 5 per game. Again, meanwhile, Klay Thompson was 10th best. So you've improved your three-point shooting. I don't think your defense has fallen off to the degree that a lot of people have argued that it has. Your role players got better, and the role players were the problem. They specifically got better at the thing that was the biggest problem. And I can only commend the Dallas Mavericks front office for this. There's some other moves I would have liked to see them make. I was a big proponent of the idea of trading Daniel Gafford, but I also understand why they didn't do that, given that he had a lot of really key moments for them last year. Within the confines of not giving up major draft capital, or signing some guy to a mega contract, or making some trade where you're getting rid of a bunch of key guys, like you lost Derrick Jones and you lost Josh Green, and I guess you can say you lost Tim Hardaway Jr., but he really wasn't doing much outside of like that one stretch for a minute in the finals. And you replaced them with 3 better players, three guys who I'm confident can all play big rotation minutes in a postseason. Klay Thompson obviously has a lot of championship experience, which I think does have some weight here. You know, let's say this team runs it back, goes to the NBA Finals again, whether it's against Boston or whoever, they're gonna perform better, especially if they can go into it relatively healthy. If Luka Doncic can be healthy, then that's really not much of a concern. That was another big reason for their defense being bad, was that Luka Doncic was just holy shit injured and couldn't carry on offense and then not be a disaster on defense on top of that. If they ran back the finals with this roster, I'm still picking the Celtics. Don't get me wrong. If they went into it next year against the Celtics, I'd still probably pick the Celtics. However, this is a team that is much improved. There is no denying that to me. I think it's a lot of the concerns have been oversold, and I kind of hate this trend with NBA fans where they just look at like a roster that has a couple of bad defenders on it and they go, oh man, these guys are going to get fucking destroyed. They're going to be the worst defense in the league. Yeah, they'll score 120, but they'll give up 140. We see that argument all the time, but defense is not as simple as that. I remember a lot of people making that argument when the Chicago Bulls assembled their Lonzo Ball, DeMar DeRozan, Vucevic from the previous trade deadline roster, Alex Caruso. Obviously, Alex and Lonzo are great defenders, but people were going like Zach LaVine, DeMar DeRozan, and Nikola Vucevic in the same starting lineup. That's going to go terribly. And then they were a top 5 defense in the entire NBA. Even managed to be a top 10 defense in the league later on when Lonzo Ball wasn't there. It's possible to be a good defense without amazing defensive personnel because it often comes down to the scheme as well as, frankly, your big man. And if your big man is a good defender, you can get away with a lot of shit. You just don't want to overstress that player by having them have to do too much because the perimeter defenders keep fucking things up. I think there's no reason to believe that the Mavericks cannot be a comparable defense to what they were previously, all while being a much better offensive team. Klay Thompson has a much better role than he did in the Warriors, so I imagine he will be a much better player than he was on the Warriors. And I like the rotation pieces that they added to this team. I would like to see some more on-ball creating ability from somebody else. They did just sign Spencer Dinwiddie. I don't really think that's going to matter. I don't think Spencer is a rotation player in the postseason, to say the least. That's why it probably took him so fucking long to get signed to begin with, because this happened like a day or two ago. However, I feel very good about this roster even without that. I would feel better if they had someone else a little bit more capable of creation, but it's all right. But yeah, that's my thoughts on the Dallas Mavericks. I think they had a damn good offseason, and while I don't know if they're my favorite to come out of the West going into next year, because the West got a whole lot better along with them, if they do manage to make it out of the West, I would give them much better odds of winning whatever series they're in. But yeah, that is it. Shout out to Alex for the research and the thumbnail, and shout out to Nick for editing this video, but that is it. Goodbye.